Good morning. This review is for the wonderful Beasts in My Belfry by Gerald Durrell, which I have just finished rereading for the first time in, I'm going to say, probably a few decades. I have read it before. I don't believe I've ever owned it before. And it was a wonderful trip through memory lane, a wonderful reading experience, and quite startling at times. So the cover illustration is by Arthur Robbins, and it is in that jokey style that a lot of the Penguin books did, though this itself is a Fontana. Oh, apparently it's an old Fontana. It's got a little number on the spine, 4161. This book is one I acquired fairly recently, specifically because I got involved in the Gerald Durrell books again. I happened to buy The Durrells of Corfu, which is a kinda non-fiction book, and there was a movie based on that, and I thought before I go into that, I'll reread the early Gerald Durrells in Corfu. I did those, and I was so enchanted that I ploughed through My Family and Other Animals, Birds, Beasts and Relatives, and then Gardens of the Gods, which I hadn't read recently. And you know how wonderful it is when you revisit an old beloved book of your younger years and you find it is as good as you ever remembered it, and maybe even better. Gerald Durrell's writing is spectacular. So I never proceeded on to the Durrells of Corfu, where all this started, but I did develop a kind of idea to reread all the Gerald Durrell books I could, because I don't own them all, as much in order as I could. I made a list of 20 to 21, and what I'm going for here is a chronological order. Gerald Durrell didn't grow up with the expectation of being an author. Writing is something that he started doing a bit later to earn more money for his other exploits, which were zoos and animals, expeditions to collect rare animals. And so I believe his first book was actually the fourth chronologically, and I could be wrong about this. I believe, or maybe the sixth, the Baffut Beagles, Baffut, one of those. And then, having decided to do this read of the books I already have, I found this amazing pile in the store. So I haven't owned this for very long. The chapters are delightful. The first one being a bevy of beasts, continuing on to a lusk of lions, a triumph of tigers, a plash of polars, a gallivant of gnus, a bumble of bears, a loom of giraffe, a superiority of camels, very apt, odd beast boy, Beasts in My Belfry, and epilogue. And I enjoyed every one of them thoroughly. In the first chapter, A Bevy of Beasts, Durrell talks a little bit about how he came to be in Whippersnade. I'm not sure how to pronounce this. It's an English place. I haven't been there. Or at least, if I have been there, it was so far before I was 9 years old that I don't remember it. Very unlikely. My family did not quite understand my obsession with animals, much like Gerald Durrell's family, so I bonded with him over that. I was the one who was always trying to go to zoos, to look at the camels, to ride on the ponies, with my mother looking vaguely bewildered in the background, and my father saying to his friends, I don't know where she gets it from. So I definitely bonded with him over that. Now, the very first chapter, it talks about the Durrells in England after the war, and Gerald's attempt to introduce a really large deer into his mother's small urban house. The deer in question was called Hortense. The house in question, I believe, was in Southampton. No, it wasn't. Somewhere by the beach. And he accidentally acquired it when its owner was moving on. And it was enormous, and it caused a lot of problems with him and his family. And at that point, he realized that if he was ever going to get more experience with the larger animals, he needed to work at a zoo. So he applied to London Zoo, and he eventually got sent to this Whippersnade. I really don't know how to pronounce that. Okay, he wrote an extremely humble letter to the Zoological Society of London. This is just post-war, or possibly even still during the war, because there are people who've been relocated from England, from Europe to England. And he gets this job as an underkeeper in Whipsnade. Someone help me out. It looks like it should be Whipsnade. Chirp. And after that, the book becomes delightful. It talks about the people he meets there and the various animals that he gets to work with in the different locations. So each chapter is when he has been given an area to work in. The first one, he's in the lion sections, which he says he thinks that's a bit harsh on a first attempt for an under keeper. But each section has got these animals and their challenges and some incredibly funny stories. This is the homicidal zebra on page 94. And these beautiful pen and ink, or at least black and white illustrations by Edward Mortimer, really enhance the story. Durrell's writing is, without exception, humorous, light-hearted, delightful. It is absolutely charming. And once again, I was absolutely charmed. Well, come on. Shriek, come on. Yes, you can do it. Well done. And this book is one of the ones that initiated my fascination in animals, which, as you can see, continues even today when I'm being bitten rigorously. Gerald Durrell's experience in Whipsnade Zoo continued for 1 year until he was 21. At that point, with a small inheritance, he tried to attach himself to a collector's party, to one of the people who were actually collecting animals for sale. None of them wanted to take him without experience. He was trying to join them, even unpaid. He didn't care. Paying his own way, he was willing to do. In order to get the experience, it was a round robin of frustration that many young people in search of a job find. In the end, he financed his own expedition and went off collecting into the great wide world. This book leads up to his experience through the zoo with the zebras and all the many, many fascinating animals. You don't have to love animals to love this book. The humour, often self-depreciating humour, Durrell's amazingly deft ability to create a fascinating scene, talk about people. It's just wonderful, and I think that anyone who likes good writing will enjoy it. And the writing is really spectacularly good when you compare it with some modern writing. It is literary in its own right, as well as being hugely entertaining. Now, going through this book, even though it's been a long time since I read it, I reacquainted myself with old stories, and it was actually exceptional realizing how influential this little red book has been on my overall life and attitude. So many of my favorite opinions about animals, zoos, the world, conservation, you can see their basis in this book. For example, the Père David story. There's a Père David Père, Father David's deer. It's a Chinese deer. And I've always known this story. I never thought it came from this book. I thought it came from a Lionel Davidson book over there. But basically, this is a deer that was found to have existed in the wild in the region that's now China 3,000 to 4,000 years ago. It died out in the wild, as far as people know, 3,000 to 4,000 years before this book was written. But it still existed in this little private garden by a Chinese emperor, kept by a Chinese emperor for personal use only. And a missionary in China discovered these deer totally illicitly by looking over the wall and by bribing their guards. This small herd of completely unknown deer. And the thing about that story that always really fascinated me was after the West had managed to acquire a couple, through heavy negotiations with the emperor, that area flooded, and the original herd of deer was completely and utterly destroyed. These are the stories of extinction in our world. One small natural incident, the flood, could have extinguished the last of the species, but because this missionary father had done the dirty on the emperor, essentially, and got a pair into the West, they now persevered and were still alive at the time of this book. Stories like that, absolutely fascinating. His love of animals and amazing ability to describe their funny personalities and personal behaviors is enhanced, as I said, by these marvelous drawings. This is a drawing of the bear Babs, who was one of his favorites, an enthusiastic and energetic bear who liked swimming and playing with lost buckets. There are so many beautiful stories about the individual animals that they spring to life for you, and I could probably talk about them for hours, but I won't do that. I'm kind of tempted, but I won't. That is The Herd of Bison, if I remember correctly. So yeah, wonderful books, great illustrations. Almost none of this is serious. This is the humor of life and the idiosyncrasies of animals. But the only serious point the only serious tone, I suppose, starts to appear in the epilogue, where he talks about how after a year in Whipsnade Zoo, he comes into his inheritance and goes off animal collecting. And his time at the zoo has cemented the fact that he wants to own his own zoo, but as Whipsnade at its time was way ahead of most zoos, it believed in huge amount of spaces. But this is where Gerald Durrell evolved the zookeeping mythos, which is, no, not the mythos, the zookeeping ethics, model, theory, philosophy that is currently employed by most zoos around the world. That zoos need to be a place to conserve species, because back then that wasn't what zoos were about. Zoos were about entertaining the public. Gerald Durrell, a visionary, saw them as the place to conserve species, to breed new animals, so that those that are becoming endangered and extinct in the wild every day will have a conservation pool, which ideally one day we will be able to re-release from, but at least which allows the species not to go to extinction otherwise. He also very much promoted the fact that the zoo enclosure needs to be suited to the inhabitant, not to the public. No cement pits with one sad animal sitting there so that the public can see it when they want to. No field so enormous that the public goes, oh, it's nice that they've got enough space, ignorant of the fact that the animal only needs a few square meters to be happy and feels isolated and scared in huge spaces. None of that. He wanted pens that were suited to the animal's needs to make them happy. And his ethics throughout his life were that a happy animal rewards you by breeding, by making more animals. And if it's not doing that, it isn't happy, and you need to modify your keeping situation, your diet, something for the animal itself. And as you can see, that passion for animals and the keeping of animals came to me as well. And it wasn't until I reread this a few days ago that I realized how much of that came from this book. In the epilogue, he gets serious about zoos and conservation and animals. That is where he pleads for animal preservation and for more understanding of the natural catastrophe that humans can be for animals in the wild. So it does get serious, but there's only a tiny, tiny bit of serious here at the end. All the rest is unadulterated pleasure. So you can skip the epilogue if you have to. I think it's important, but it's more important to have the pure enjoyment that is most of this book. Now, what was the other things that I want to talk about? Oh, yes. In that epilogue, he talks about the zoo that he has already established, I believe, at the time he writes this book. That is the Jersey Zoo, which is once again now called the Gerald Durrell Zoo. I've never been there. I've always wanted to. When I was very young, I became a member of the Dodo Club. Until a few years ago, I had this little pin of a little red dodo. And for years, I used to get these periodicals talking about all the animals of the zoo and all the things in the zoo. And I pleaded regularly to go to Jersey on holiday to see this zoo. I never did. But maybe one day I will. Who knows? Now, how instrumental this book has been on my attitude to zoology and animals and nature was a delightful surprise. I thoroughly enjoyed reading that. There was another surprise in store for me at the epilogue, right at the beginning of it. Durrell talks about how his time at Whipsnade also enabled him to do a lot more reading on the background of zoology. And back then there wasn't as much natural history books as there are now. He read some of the ancients like Pliny and his stories about lions and so forth. And he makes some very humorous points about what people thought lions and bears and tigers and their natures were like versus what he saw in the actual animals around him. So that's also a lot of fun. In the epilogue, was it the epilogue? It was right toward the end. One thing Whipsnade did do for me was to make me an even more avid and omnivorous reader than I was already. Well, there you go. I never knew how I chose omnivorous reader. I just thought it made sense. It seems that Gerald Durrell on page 185 in his epilogue reached forward way in time to name this channel, and I didn't know it, and he didn't know it, having died, most unfortunately, in 1995. Thank you for watching this rambling review. I hope the take-home message has been that this is an extremely good book in many, many ways, and a good book that you should read. But if you don't read this book, read other good books. Bye.